something? Is there someone you've been meaning to speak to? Someone whose name quietly returns when the world around you grows still. Perhaps there was something you wanted to tell them. Something simple, something honest, something that somehow became tomorrow's conversation again and again. You don't have to answer. Just keep that person somewhere close to your thoughts for a little while. Tonight, we'll cross a river. The journey itself is short, only a few quiet minutes from one shore to the other. But not every crossing is measured by distance. Some are measured by the weight we carry without anyone else ever noticing. The ferryman reached the river before sunrise, just as he had for countless mornings before. He never needed to look at the sky to know the hour. The river always told him. So did the gold beneath the wooden planks at his feet. He had crossed those waters for longer than most people in the village could remember. He knew where the current pulled the hardest. He knew which boards would creak before they ever complained. And over the years, he had learned something else. Some passengers wished to be left alone. Others were quietly hoping someone would ask them a question. The first crossing of the morning was almost always the quietest. The farmers came later. The merchants arrived after the sun had climbed above the trees. But before the village had fully awakened, the river belonged to those who preferred to leave unnoticed. That morning, the first passenger was a young man, perhaps 24, perhaps 25. He walked with the hurried steps of someone who felt late, even though no one was waiting to greet him. He carried a small leather bag over one shoulder. When he reached the landing, he asked whether this would be the first crossing of the day. The ferryman told him it was. The young man nodded, but instead of looking across the river, he turned and looked back along the road he had just traveled, as though some part of him still wondered whether he should return. A moment later, he stepped into the ferry. shifted beneath his weight. His hand instinctively reached for the side. The ferryman calmly asked him to sit near the middle. The river was gentle that morning, but gentle water was still moving water. The young man sat where he was told. He placed his bag carefully between his feet. For a moment, he appeared perfectly still. Then, one thumb slowly began rubbing across the other. Again and again, a tiny movement, easy to miss, but not for someone who had spent a lifetime watching people cross a river. The ferryman had seen that restless habit before. It never belonged to impatience. It belonged to people standing close to a decision, hoping time might make it for them. Before the ferryman could untie the rope, another traveler approached. They heard him before they saw him. The quiet rhythm of a walking stick touching the ground. Then another step. Then another. Out of the morning mist, an old man slowly appeared. His coat was worn, but carefully cared for. In one hand he carried a walking stick. Beneath his other arm rested a small wooden box. It wasn't large. It wasn't decorated. Its corners had been softened by years of handling. The brass clasp had long since lost its shine. The old man held it close against his chest, not like something precious, more like something that simply could not be allowed to fall. The ferryman stepped forward to steady the boat. The young man rose from his seat. After only a brief hesitation, he offered the old man his hand. The old man accepted it with a grateful nod. The ferryman quietly remarked that there was no need to hurry. The old man answered that time had already taken enough from him. For once, it could afford to wait. Carefully, he stepped into the ferry. As the boat shifted beneath them, his hand moved immediately toward the wooden box, not toward the side of the boat, not toward the bench, toward the box. The young man noticed. He didn't say anything. Once seated, the old man rested the box across his knees. Even then, both hands remained gently folded over its lid. The young man politely asked whether he was comfortable. The old man replied that he was comfortable enough. The answer was light. His hands were not. A moment later, the ferryman untied the thick rope. The boat slowly drifted away from the landing. Behind them, the shore began disappearing into the morning mist. For a while, the oars were the only things that spoke. The ferryman watched the current. The young man watched the fog. And the old man watched the wooden box. The young man tried not to look at it. For several moments, he succeeded. Then curiosity quietly drew his eyes back again. The old man noticed, without the slightest trace of annoyance, he gently remarked that the young man was welcome to ask. Embarrassed, the young man apologized. He explained that he hadn't meant to stare. The old man answered that he hadn't been staring at all. He had simply been wondering. The young man admitted that was true. The old man smiled ever so slightly. He said that many good conversations begin with curiosity. Encouraged by those words, the young man finally asked what the wooden box contained. The old man rested his thumb lightly against the worn brass clasp. He told the young man that he was free to ask. Whether he would receive an answer was another matter. The young man almost smiled. He asked again, this time more gently. The old man studied his face for a quiet moment. Then he said the answer could wait. There was something else he wished to ask first. He adjusted the box ever so slightly across his knees. His fingers tightened around it, only enough for someone paying close attention to notice. Then, in a voice as calm as the river itself, he told the young man that before they reached the opposite shore, he wished to ask him for a favor. The young man wondered what kind of favor it could possibly be. The old man remained silent for a few moments. He looked toward the bank that had already disappeared behind the mist. And when he finally spoke again, he said it was not anyone who had known him before that morning. It was a favor that only a stranger could do. And for the first time since stepping into the ferry, the young man forgot to look back. The old man lowered his eyes once more. For a long while, he said nothing. The young man did not interrupt him. There are silences that ask to be respected. This was one of them. At last, the old man admitted that every story chooses its own beginning. People only imagine they are the ones telling it. He said his own story did not begin with the wooden box. It began on an ordinary autumn afternoon, more than 30 years earlier. He had been a younger man then, strong enough to believe that difficult conversations could always wait until tomorrow. Tomorrow, he had discovered, was an extraordinarily patient liar. It always promised another chance. Until one day, it stopped making promises. The ferry continued drifting quietly through the morning mist. Only the steady rhythm of the oars broke the stillness. The young man listened without taking his eyes from the old man's face. He had almost forgotten the box. Almost. The old man noticed. He smiled very faintly. Then he admitted that curiosity was a strange companion. At first, it asks what is inside the box. Later, it begins asking why the box was ever closed. He said that was the better question. The young man agreed. The old man rested one hand upon the worn lid. His fingers followed the scratches in the wood as though they were reading words no one else could see. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he revealed the first truth. The box contained letters. Nothing more, nothing less. The young man seemed surprised. Letters did not appear heavy enough to demand such careful hands. The old man quietly explained that paper had never been the thing weighing upon him. Some letters, he said, grow heavier with every year they remain unread. The young man asked whether they had been written to someone far away. The old man answered that distance had never been measured in miles. Some people lived only a street away and were still impossible impossible to reach. Others had crossed oceans, yet remained close enough to hear in memory. The young man wondered whether the letters had ever been delivered. The old man looked toward the river. A long silence settled between them. Even the ferryman seemed to slow his stroke. Finally, the old man answered. Not one, not a single letter had ever left the box. The words had all been written. The envelopes had all been sealed. The names had all been carefully written by hand. But none of them had ever been carried farther than the room in which they were written. The young man found himself unable to understand. He asked why anyone would write so many letters, only to hide them away forever. The old man's expression did not change. He said there was something strangely comforting about believing a letter could still be sent tomorrow, as long as it remained inside the box. Hope remained inside with it. Posting it meant accepting whatever answer might come, or worse, accepting that no answer would ever come. The old man looked back down at the box resting across his knees. Very softly, he admitted that the oldest letter inside had been waiting for more than 30 years. The ferryman guided the boat across the slow current with the same quiet rhythm he had kept since leaving the opposite shore. The old man finally broke the silence. He said the first letter had been written on a rainy evening. He remembered the sound of water striking the window more clearly than the words he had written. He believed that writing was easier than speaking. Ink never interrupted. Paper never looked disappointed. The young man listened carefully. He wondered whether the letter had been an apology. The old man answered that it had begun as one. Whether it had ended that way, he could no longer remember. Time, he said, has a habit of rewriting even our own memories. He rested his hand gently on the lid of the box. There had been days, he admitted, when he had opened it only to read the oldest letter once again, not to send it, simply to convince himself that he still could. The young man quietly asked whether anyone had ever discovered the box. The old man smiled. His wife had seen it many times. She had dusted it, moved it from one shelf to another. Once, she had even asked whether there was anything valuable inside. The old man had answered yes, and somehow that had not been a lie. The young man looked toward the river. The water moved steadily beneath them, always forward, never once looking back. He wondered aloud whether the old man had ever regretted waiting so long. The answer came without hesitation. Every morning and every evening. Regret, the old man said, keeps remarkably faithful hours. The ferryman glanced toward the widening river ahead. Without turning around, he spoke for the first time in quite a while. He quietly observed that rivers were fortunate. They never had the chance to stop halfway. Then he returned to his silence. The old man watched the water for a few moments. He seemed to appreciate the ferryman's words without responding to them. Then he looked back at the young man. He admitted there was something he had not yet told him. The young man waited. The old man slowly traced a finger across the lid of the box. He took a slow breath. Then, almost as though he were confessing it to himself, he revealed the truth. The box did not contain one unfinished conversation. It contained many. Some carried one name, some another. One was addressed to a brother, several to his wife. One had been written to a friend he never saw again. And one. The old man stopped. His thumb rested on the brass clasp. He did not finish the sentence. Instead, he lifted his eyes toward the young man. Very quietly, he admitted that the last letter had been written to someone who had never even known his name. The young man felt a question rise inside him, but for the first time since boarding the ferry, he chose not to ask it. Some answers he was beginning to understand arrived only after silence had been given enough time. The old man kept his hand on the wooden box. The opposite shore was clearer now. Trees emerged from the mist, and beyond them, the faint outline of a narrow road. The young man waited. At last, the old man explained that the first letter had been written to his brother. They had argued over something so small that neither of them remembered the cause years later, but both had remembered the bride. His brother left town before the letter was sent. The old man believed there would be time to find him. There was not. After that, the box became a place for every sentence he failed to speak. A letter to his wife after a winter of silence. A letter to an old friend he had betrayed. A letter to his son who had grown tired of waiting for an apology. Each one had been written honestly. Each one had remained inside the box. The young man asked why he continued writing if he never intended to send them. The old man looked toward the approaching shore. He admitted that writing allowed him to feel brave without having to act bravely. For one evening, he could become the man who told the truth. By morning, he could fold the truth away again. The young man lowered his eyes. Something in those words had reached him. The old man noticed, but asked nothing. The ferry passed through a patch of sunlight. For the first time, the brass clasp on the box shone brightly. The old man placed his thumb beneath it. This time, he opened it. Inside were dozens of sealed envelopes, some yellow with age, some newer, all carefully arranged. The young man looked at the names written across them. Then he noticed one envelope resting apart from the others. It carried no address, no town, no name. The old man lifted it from the box. He held it for a moment, then admitted that this had been the hardest letter to write. The young man asked who it belonged to. The old man looked at the blank envelope. His answer was almost lost beneath the sound of the river. He said it had never been meant for another person. The sound of the oars became softer with every stroke. Ahead, the small wooden landing emerged from the morning mist. Neither man hurried to stand. The old man still held the unopened letter in his hand. For a long while, he simply looked at it. Then he smiled. It was not the smile of someone remembering happier days. It was the quiet smile of someone who had finally stopped running from them. The young man gently asked whether the letter had been written to the man he used to be. The old man nodded. He said that all his life he had believed forgiveness had to come from someone else. A brother, a wife, a friend, a son. losing enough years had he discovered that one voice had remained silent through all of them, his own. He folded the letter once more and placed it carefully back inside the box. The young man hesitated. He quietly admitted that he had expected the old man to ask him to deliver one of the letters. The old man gave a gentle shake of his head. He said that there had been a time when he believed that was why he had come to the river. But somewhere between one shore and the other, he had realized he had been mistaken. He never needed someone to carry the letters. He only needed one person. Someone with no memories of him, to know that they had existed, to know that they had been written, to know that at least once he had found the courage to tell the truth, even if only to paper. The ferry touched the wooden landing with a quiet knock. The ferryman stepped forward and secured the rope. Then, for the first time since the journey had begun, he looked directly at the old man. Very calmly, he spoke. He said that every crossing ends on a shore, but not every burden does. The old man thanked him with a small nod. He stood slowly, lifted the wooden box beneath one arm, and took his walking stick in the other. The young man rose as well. The old man then reached out his hand. The young man accepted it. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, yet it carried the weight of an entire morning. The old man thanked him for listening, not for solving anything, not for offering advice, simply for staying. The mist welcomed him once again. With every step, he became a little less distinct, until at last he disappeared completely. The young man remained where he was. The ferryman quietly untied the boat, preparing for another crossing. Before stepping aboard again, the young man opened his own travel bag. Inside, folded between a few belongings, lay a single unfinished letter. He looked at it for a long moment. Then, instead of returning it to the bag, he slipped it into his coat pocket. Some letters, he thought, should not spend another season waiting. He looked once toward the road where the old man had vanished. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction. The river continued its endless journey between the two quiet shores.